Yeah, the new system just keeps doing that. We just tested it. Well, we're live now. Civil War. So this is an article that came out from the Washington Examiner about how this survival camp network is calling in its members, those who are in areas of high volatility, to come to the camp for the week of the election because things may get absolutely crazy. Right now, in the national aggregate polling, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are tied. I don't think that means this country is actually divided. I think if Kamala Harris was up 3 to 5 points, it might show a division. I think a tie actually indicates, with Democrat bias and the margin of error, that Trump is probably winning. But it's still, you don't need a 50-50 split for there to be a civil war or major conflict. In fact, it could be even as small as only a couple percentage points of people who are willing to get violent, and that's pretty worrisome. But we're going to talk about all of it. We got a couple great guests today on the Culture War. We got Rudyard Lynch back.
Thank you so much for having me, especially so soon.
Pull that mic back up.
Thanks so much for having me, especially so soon.
Right on. And do you want to just introduce yourself? You have a YouTube channel.
As I said before, I am a 23-year-old with no credentials who bets against God. And I run the YouTube channel Whatifalthist, which talks about history, anthropology, philosophy, that sort of thing. And we have close to 700,000 subscribers. And the thing I'm most known for is my prediction of 1,000 deaths by April, where I think America will have a civil war or revolution within the next year.
Wow. That's really soon. We got Scott Greer hanging out.
What's up?
Who are you?
Good to be here.
Yeah.
And so my story, I'm a highly respected author and podcaster. I host a podcast called Highly Respected, and I have a Substack, Highly Respected, and that's at highly-respected.com. I'm also author of No Campus for White Men that came out a long time ago, 7 years ago.
Oh, yeah. I just love that you're the 23-year-old with no credentials and you're the highly respected author and podcaster.
Yeah,
so.
Real credentials here, I guess.
So, okay, I'll throw it to you, Scott, first. 1,000 deaths by April with a civil war coming in 1 year. Is this man insane?
Well, who's doing the killing and who's doing the dying? That would be my question, is who are the 1,000 people being killed and who's killing them? Is it the government killing them? Is it who's rising up? Is it the left or the right? I don't think there is going to be that type of violence, even if you compare this to some like 2020. We had a whole summer of unrest where every city in the country, people were burning down buildings, cops nowhere to be found. There's a high level of violence and insecurity and turmoil, all dealing with COVID lockdowns, BLM, everything going along with that. People were really worked up in 2020. If you see it now in 2024, either from the right, Trump has been indicted and convicted with not that many protests. People are still supporting him, but they don't feel like taking it to the streets. And it's the same with the left. The left doesn't have the type of aggressive, violent demonstrations that they were having in 2020 or even during the Trump years. So I don't really see the 1,000 deaths happening unless the economy completely craters. It's something worse than the Great Recession. Even if it's a very close election, I don't think we're going to see Stop the Steal again. It might be Stop the Steal 2, the direct-to-video version. But even then, I don't know what that would look like. With the left, I don't even think there was going to be that large of the women's marches. They don't seem as activated right now. They're even more resigned that Trump is going to win. There's this awareness that there's a good chance he's going to win. And I think even among a lot of liberals, their gut instinct is saying Trump's going to win. Well, in 2016, they were so outraged and took to the streets because they're like, there's no way this could have ever happened. And then it happened and they lost their minds. So, but you may explain who's doing the killing and who's doing the dying here. And that might explain the situation.
It's hard for me to know where to start because the lore I've established around this is so extensive. I've made like 6 hours of content just on the one Civil War topic. But I operate off probabilistic assessments. And so if you look at, let's say, dominoes or cards or anything, or poker, anything like that, you have probabilistic assessments up to a certain range. And then you don't know the individual events. And that's how I feel about Civil War, where it's one of those things where I know that something's going to happen, and I'm not entirely clear what exact form it will take, and it's highly dependent upon the individual context. And I'm going to use World War I as an example. There were about 15 different places where World War I nearly started before World War I. It was a war that building up for decades, and you happened to get the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and that set up World War I in a way that didn't have to happen, where Britain might not have been involved in the war, America might not have been involved. Hell, there's plenty of timelines where Austria and France were allies against Germany and Russia. Yeah. So that's how I feel about this, where I look at the incentive. I think the right and the left have to have a war. And on the last show I was on here, we talked about...
You mean at like a philosophical level, the divergence between the left and the right precipitates some kind of conflict? You said they have to have some kind of war.
What I meant by that is that the forces of history have built up to the level where it's the only way to solve the equation. Where we're at the point where we don't have any other mechanism to solve the underlying issues going on except war. Because you look at, and I think there's like 10 issues killing America, between wages being too low, the healthcare system, aging. There's a bunch of these, and Congress isn't going to solve them. And so issues will gradually pile up until you have a war. And I've assessed... I used to have a wider time frame, but I'm making the bet that it's going to start this year for a variety of reasons. And I'm open to being wrong. I make these bets so I'm not just a charlatan making stuff up. But I think it's going to start this year.
I mean, we've got a month and a half, not even. We're about to enter November, so yeah. 2 months. Do you think within this, something's going to kick off? I mean, there are potentialities. Look, the first thing you always got to check is your normalcy bias and your optimism bias.
Yes.
No one saw COVID lockdowns coming. That was outside of the minds of possibility. When I talked to Eric Prince about countries that have collapsed, and I asked him, in your experience with countries that have been these states of turmoil, revolution, civil war, what do you see happening in the United States? He said, the one thing he can tell me is that no one sees it coming. Everybody he's worked with who's been in these countries, one day everything's normal. The next day the internet doesn't work, the power is out, and people are fighting. So how do you actually know when that flashpoint is going to be? Maybe it is November 6th. I wonder. We're looking at the national polls, and I'll actually let me pull these up for you real quick. So this is the national aggregate from yesterday, and we covered this with Kamala Harris in aggregate up nationally 0.2, which is a statistical tie. As of today, Real Clear Polling has a literal tie between Harris and Trump by aggregating all of the existing polls over the past 2 weeks. A tie would indicate a Trump victory because the polls have historically favored Democrats by about 3 to 5 points, and in the battleground states 4 to 7. And I'm going back to 2016. Those are not my numbers. That is not my opinion. That is literally what happened. And if we extrapolate that and apply to today, Donald Trump may actually win the popular vote by a minimum of 3 points. Who knows? Who knows? Polls change and things change. It's just we're looking at the past to try and predict the future. What happens? Everybody's predicting we're not going to know the results until 13 days later or 10 days later because of mail-in voting. But what if Trump wins so handily in early voting and absentee voting that on election day, the big networks say there is no point in waiting any longer for the existing mail-in votes. We know how many there are, and they will not change the outcome. Could that, on November 6th, trigger a leftist reaction? You don't. Let me try and describe it like this. If I were to say right now that tomorrow there will be a 1,000-acre fire wiping out large portions of Appalachia, you'd be like, "What? Wait, wow, is that great?" Yeah, a guy may be driving a truck with a chain dangling off the back, and he makes a sharp turn, whips, snaps the ground, igniting some tinder, and that tiny little fire that no one saw coming explodes into a wildfire where fire is spreading 70 miles an hour across the top of these trees. That is a potentiality, but does that mean it's a high probability? I don't think there's a high probability of wildfires starting, but when they do, how do you stop them? And I suppose what I'm trying to say is, to say there's going to be this big grandiose eruption of fire all across California, people are going to be like, well, that's a doomsday scenario. Yeah, but it could really just start from someone flicking a cigarette.
Yes. The calculation I make, and this is one of the weird logical issues in our society, is that a civil war will happen when the civil war is the rational calculation for the players involved. And this is one of the horrible things we don't want to realize, but war is normally a completely rational calculation. I can probabilistically assess that my side will beat your side and we can take your stuff. And I believe the 2024 election is going to set things off because for both sides, they've entered into a position of fundamental weakness where they have an incentive to start a war because it's safer rather than continuing with the peace, because peace is often more dangerous than war. And so for the right and the left, they've pushed their hands too far, and now they need to pull their hands back because they can't survive as things go on. For the right, it's the money printing and the immigration. And those are two things that people have no comprehension how big they are. For money printing, we've added $900 billion to the deficit just since July. And we don't understand how big $900 billion.
Debt, you mean?
Yeah. And that's bigger than a lot of countries in the world. I'm sure someone can look up in the comments and say that's the economy of, like, I don't know, some European country. And so that's the first thing. It took us all of American history to reach the amount of debt we had in 2014, and we've doubled it in the decades since. And the money printing under Biden, it can't go on. It's just killing the economy. And I don't believe the official numbers. I think they're being doctored. I think things are way worse. And so money printing's one. Another 4 years of Biden will destroy society. And then immigration. We've had 15 million illegal immigrants during the Biden administration. That's adding a Pennsylvania to the country. And it's a Pennsylvania overnight without the centuries it took to build up the state. And so 4 years Biden, 15 million more illegal immigrants. And Elon Musk has done a good job talking about this. I really admire Elon Musk's latest stand. And basically, if the Democrats can keep flooding illegals in, they can win a bunch of states if the illegals can vote. So
They don't need to vote.
What do you mean?
Illegal immigrants don't need to vote for Democrats to win control of win the electoral vote and win the presidency and the federal government. So this is actually a big mistake Republicans have made for a very long time in saying that the Democrats are bringing in illegal immigrants so they can vote and vote for Democrats. No, they're not. They're bringing in illegal immigrants so the census will count them and give them more congressional seats and more electoral college votes. California is estimated to have, at minimum, in the last cycle, 1 extra vote.
Yeah.
However, if you actually calculate the total illegal immigrant population of California, they may have as many as 10 or 13 extra illegal votes. Let me clarify this. So if you have a district, a congressional district, which is 775,000 people, but 200,000 are non-citizens. They can't vote, but they do give that seat. You do the math.
Yeah.
Democrats can then invite in non-citizens, spread them out in such a way that they create extra congressional districts.
Yes.
Then when it comes to, so this is what's funny about the national popular vote and the national popular vote initiatives. It's not completely true. We saw Adam Kinzinger, everyone's roasting him because he said we should get rid of electoral college and go to a popular vote. But a popular vote may actually favor Republicans. California's got 10 million Republicans, many of whom are demoralized and feel like, I think they end up getting about 6 million votes or whatever. If it was a national popular vote, you may see blue state Republicans voting, and it could shift things in a way people don't predict. So right now, the numbers are that there are more blue state Republicans than there are red state Democrats. Red states tend to be sparsely populated. There's not that many Democrats in the red states relative to how many Republicans are in blue states. If you go national popular vote and those Republicans vote, combined with the rural states, it may turn this country deep red. But anyway, I digress. So when we look at the Electoral College, you have to factor in that Democrats likely are getting 5 extra Electoral College votes by having non-citizens spread out through their states, which is why Chicago is getting flooded. New York is getting flooded. California is getting flooded. It's a long game because the census is every 10 years. But you also have to consider at the federal congressional level. This means that Democrats have extra members of Congress voting. So when you say, Rudyard, that civil war will start when it becomes the rational decision of either side, I would agree we're at a point where it is terrifying, but you may actually see people make that argument that has become rational for them to engage in some kind of, and people, I want to make sure I clarify this when I say civil war. It's not necessarily going to be it is not a standing army ordering their troops to go march on another state. That's ridiculous. This is people who watch too many movies. It could literally just be a state suing another state at the Supreme Court saying invalidate those votes, because these are built upon non-citizens who are influencing our government. Then you get a federal law. Let's say a federal law passes, narrow margins. And then you get a few red states arguing that due to the inclusion of non-citizens in the congressional apportionment, Democrats, by winning by one vote in Congress to pass a law that, say, would encroach on gun rights or free speech rights, violating the Constitution, and then a Biden or Harris signs the bill, they say, no, we refuse to enforce this under this ruling. It goes to the Supreme Court, which, of course, is conservative. They rule in favor of the red state. The Democrats then say something like, you see, this is Trump's stacked court, and they're now overturning Congress and the president. We can't allow this. And you get two sides arguing that they are morally justified in their use of force to whatever degree that is. And then it could be starting very simply. Texas says, we will not abide by this national restriction or whatever. Texas, as we already saw with illegal immigration, then starts making moves to remove illegal immigration. Let's say the issue is illegal immigration. Texas was already in conflict with the federal government on the border, setting up razor wire and barring the feds from jurisdiction they claimed they had a right to. This is how things like this could start, where it's it's two cars speeding towards each other, and neither side has any means of resolving this. With a situation like Texas, which was scary, and this is only in the past year, Alaska is talking about sending down troops to aid the feds. Then you had a handful of states, even Florida, sending National Guard and State Guard to go defend Texas in Texas assertion of a right over their border. You had the Supreme Court involved. When it comes to something like this, we are looking at dry tinder on the forest floor, and then you get CBP and federal agents demanding to be given access to the border they claim jurisdiction over, while the state is saying no, and we're laying razor wire, concertina wire. And then all it takes is one accident. Somebody not even flicking a cigarette, but a chain. This is actually a story that started one of the fires. A guy apparently had a chain hanging from the back of his pickup truck, and as he was dragging it, it was bouncing off the ground and sparking, and it lit tinder. There was no intention. So let's say something happens where it's late at night, it's 2 a.m, and the feds say, look, this is our jurisdiction. We're going to do a patrol. State Guard or National Guard are down there, and they see some guys walking, and they're wearing polos and khakis or something. They don't know that they're supposed to be there. They're not in direct communication. Something happens and a bang goes off. Maybe it's a Mexican army or a cartel member opens fire or something. These guys don't know what's happening, so they draw their weapons. Both sides see two groups drawing weapons on each other with guns going off. They take cover. Somebody shoots. It could perhaps even be a cartel member intentionally trying to spark conflict, but a National Guard member or a federal officer gets shot and killed. Then a guy who that's his best friend, who's been working with for 10 years, sees it happen and just starts opening fire. And this is where you get something nobody expects. It spirals out of control. Texas says federal agents opened fire on our guards, and the feds say they shot my friend. They were shooting at us. Does that resolve simply with everybody calm down? We don't want to go this route. Or is it an escalation of tensions where they say, the feds come in and say, we're going to start arresting National Guard, everyone involved, you turn their names over now. The state says, we will not turn over the name of our guardsmen who are legally authorized to use these weapons when you were shooting at us. The state then says, we demand the feds withdraw and you turn over the men who shot our guys. Both say no. Do they back away? We have no idea. Now, I would say that seems like a 1 in a million or a 1 in 100 million. Who knows? But you can imagine a scenario like that being dangerously close when the only difference in that story that I just told and what literally happened is that the feds ultimately said, we're gonna back down. Everyone's going to chill out. But imagine if an accident occurred, the flicking of a cigarette, the sparking of a chain, that wildfire grows rapidly and you can't control it. How about the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand? One guy dying, igniting World War I.
But I would say they would calm down in that situation. Even when it looked at the situation with Texas last year with the border, or I think it was even earlier this year, with the wire fence, the Supreme Court didn't order Texas to remove it. It simply said the feds now had the power to remove it. And I think the Texas made it annoying to remove it, but they were able to remove it eventually. So Texas would not go up to that level to spark lethal violence. And even when they send state guard down there and National Guard and state law enforcement, they're told you can't really use your weapons. You can just only monitor the situation.
No, they were,
I don't think
they were told they could use their weapons in defense, and they actually fired across the border.
Only in defense. And even in that, but even the situation at the night, but they're not going. First off, I don't even think of nighttime patrols of doing that many nighttime patrols. And in any case, if that situation happened, the state would take most of the blame, even nationally. And that which would be bad for Texas. And I would support Texas in this regard. But if Trump is the winner, we no longer have to worry about this situation because Texas is going to back federal immigration enforcement with Trump being the person running it.
Then let's talk about another scenario. The first thing I want to respond to that with is no one thought the first Civil War was going to happen. Fort Sumter wasn't even considered the start of the Civil War. The Battle of Fort Sumter, only one person died. It was an accident. After that battle happened, the history books have declared the Civil War hath begun, except the people of the United States still didn't believe it. And so when it came to the first Battle of Bull Run, they were picnicking. And they're like, there's no Civil War, nothing's going to happen. And then there was a massacre with there's this famous drawing of the mayor frantically running. It's a drawing because there's no photos. And then people realized we are in and in fact, even at that point, they still didn't call it the Civil War. It wasn't until a couple of years later it started being called a civil war. It was called a rebellion or war between states or something like this. So in the instance of something happening in Texas, it may be an accident that no one wants to take responsibility for. But even then, if there's one accidental death, the history books may say that was the moment things ignited, even if we here in the weeds don't see it as such. But anyway, I digress. We'll entertain another scenario. Let's say you're completely correct. California. Donald Trump is going to implement massive immigration reforms and deportations. He says he wants to use local police and military now. When I asked him, he said local police. Now he's saying we would use military to a certain degree. What do you think California does if Donald Trump sends in federal authorities to start going door to door, not just ICE, but expanding ICE and ordering local police and sheriffs and National Guard? I think there's a possibility that it starts here. Trump says we're deporting the illegal immigrants. They're not allowed to be here. They need to be here legally. And so he sends in ICE. California blocks him. Trump says, we need the law of the federal government to be enforced. And as such, I am invoking my right to direct the National Guard of California, which the law states, if the law is, the federal law states that if law is not being enforced, the federal government can assume command of the National Guard to enforce the law. So then he says to the California National Guard, you will go to these homes. You will take these illegal immigrants and load them into buses, get them on planes, and send them back to their home countries and processing centers. What if California says no? And then California, the governor, says to the National Guard, do not obey those orders from the federal government. You are California National Guard. You will not obey Donald Trump's fascist Nazi takeover. Is that a possibility?
I mean, it is a possibility, but we already had a situation like this play out in the 60s over integration. And when the National Guard was federalized, the government backed down. And I think they would do the same here. There's too much respect for federal authority. The state, the national state, even compared to the 1860s, is far stronger. And even in that scenario where you're talking about the Civil War, South Carolina had already seceded. So had several other states. And when this was a foreign country firing on the United States at that point. And everyone...
Fort Sumter was in South Carolina. So this wasn't...
But it was a United States military installation. So, and South Carolina was no longer in the U.S. or it declared it was no longer in the U.S.
Not according to the Union.
But it had declared itself, and it was another entity firing on the federal government, the U.S.
According to the Union and the federal troops, it was a state-level entity attacking the federal authorities as one country.
But it had already seceded.
South
Carolina already saw itself as a separate country.
But to the Union, there was no such secession. It was
but
not
that
legal.
Marked the secession.
No, it didn't. The Union never viewed the southern states as having left the United States.
They were fighting to bring them back, but that
No. They did not view them as separate.
Tim is objectively correct here.
The Union never looked at South Carolina.
The Union never saw them, but as actual practice, they were outside of it. But they were fighting to restore them to the Union and bring them back into fully in line with the rest of the Union.
There's an important...
But the war, and everyone knew that war was a strong possibility, and they were trying to avoid a Fort Sumter.
No, this is completely incorrect.
Let me interject.
Nobody
No one
knew.
saw that the war was going to happen when
That's
they
why.
started seceding.
That's why they were picnicking at Bull Run.
They were picnicking because they thought there would only be one battle, and they weren't.
That's not
aware.
true.
Yes, it was. They were not. When war happened, they thought that war. When the South started seceding, there was this desire to see what would happen. And they were hoping that the South would come back to its senses, that even the seceded states, that they would make these compromises and that they would come back and avoid war. But once Fort Sumter happened and both sides are raising armies and then sending them to Manassas.
They were not raising armies. That is incorrect.
The South was absolutely raising armies. They were using their state militias and using that as Confederate
Okay, we got to pause. That's not
Confederate
true.
army.
The Lincoln did not mobilize until after Bull Run, and only 7 states had seceded in the first place. It was after Bull Run, the mobilization that Lincoln tried to implement, that sparked 4 more states to secede.
No, it was Fort Sumter prompted the 4 other states to leave. You can look this up. No, it was the 4 other states.
Right, maybe you're correct.
Fort Sumter was that, and Fort Sumter, then they began raising troops.
Yeah, I believe you're correct. I stand
think
corrected. I think you're right.
the draft and conscription, I'm pretty sure that happens after Fort Sumter, but that could have also
What's
been.
the
But
point
they
of
were
contention?
utilizing both sides were utilizing the state militias and what troops they could find and deploying them out in the battlefield.
I stand corrected. You are correct. It was 3 days after Fort Sumter, Lincoln mobilized to send troops.
Yes.
Prompting the secession.
What do you guys? What's your point of contention here?
I guess we're arguing over the original Civil War, so we should go into the future.
No,
The point is that people did not think a war had begun even after Fort Sumter.
Yeah, Tim's right here. I basically completely agree with the things Tim said.
But I was wrong about
What do you mean that a war hadn't begun? Violence had erupted.
Nobody died.
People were massively coping.
They were firing cannons. People could easily die. It's not like they're just firing blanks at each other or having a paintball match.
We have a tremendous amount of primary sources from this time period, and Tim is right, where people didn't think the war was happening until way past the point they were already in it. And there was
They didn't think it was going to be a long war. They thought that one battle would solve the whole matter.
But they didn't even call it the Civil War for a couple years.
Yeah, but it was a war. And it was, by the end of 1861, several people had died and everyone knew that this was a war.
So if you look at the Democrat platform and then you look at the various political politicians, the various positions the politicians had, there was tremendous coping about the war until pretty far in, where people would say, oh my God, the South's going to back down. It's all the things you just said. The South's just doing this for attention. The South, this isn't a real conflict. This is just a constitutional crisis. And then it kept spiraling and spiraling and spiraling.
That's true. But Fort Sumter was the break that's saying, oh shit, this is.
I'm unclear
serious.
how this relates to the point we're trying to convey, though.
I
was going to say that I agreed with Tim's point that these you have gasoline and then there's a match and it's unclear what the match is going to be, but there's always has to be a match.
But the match can be innocuous.
Exactly.
It can be such a small and mundane thing that under normal circumstances doesn't matter.
Yes.
Let's say you have a rainy fall and a guy starts chucking M80s and is flamethrowering all across California. No wildfire can start. But you get a dry summer and someone can accidentally, maybe they're driving their car and they get a flat tire, the tire rips off and then it scrapes on the ground, sparking, the whole thing goes up.
I'm laughing because the first thought that came into my mind is Mr. Beast making a video. I started a California wildfire.
And his mouth
I started the Civil War in California could maybe be his next video. But even on that, we did, with the conflict between federal and state authority, we did have that in the 50s and 60s over integration, and the federal authority won out. And even the states could call upon mobs of violent young men to side with them, even in the case of Ole Miss in 62 when they were trying to integrate it. And at Little Rock, they had not just the National Guard and state police, they also had these mobs. And I don't think California would have, the type of imposing mobs they had in Ole Miss, and Little Rock aren't going to be the middle-aged cat ladies who are going to come out to prevent people from enforcing a federal immigration law.
So we'll pause here and I'll say, it's interesting to entertain the similarities between 1860, and technically you'd go back through Bleeding Kansas, and you'd even go back to 1820 when they were already discussing Civil War. In fact, there was already contention during the signing of the Declaration of Independence over slavery. You look at that, and what you have is sovereign states with a weak federal union, and when they decided the federal union was going to go up against the states, what was stronger, that is not typical of any Civil War ever. That is the United States as sovereign states effectively in a large-scale war, which is kind of like more like Europe than anything else. If you take a look at Spain or Russia, a tiny fraction in key areas uses violence to seize control from a rather apathetic general population that doesn't want to be involved. And so what we see here is it may be that it's our bias of 1861 that we say maybe the feds will come into Texas, maybe Trump will try and enforce some mass immigration thing. Then a state like we saw this in 2020 when Democrats ran a war game where they actually entertained West Coast states seceding from the Union if Donald Trump were to have won in 2020. That was Boston Globe reporting. They literally got like John Podesta was hanging out with these other big uniparty neolibs and neocons being like, okay, if Trump wins, we're going to need Oregon, Washington, California to secede from the Union unless Donald Trump guarantees constitutional reforms and things like this. So that conversation was happening, and it's kind of crazy. But I think it's largely due to our biases that we think that's how things would play out. I think it's entirely possible that what we end up seeing is more like Chaz Chop level times 10 times 100. So we actually had a period in this country where for a few months in the Pacific Northwest, there were autonomous zones set up to the point where they had armed guards. They had taken over a police department, kicked out the local police force, surrounded that, and were in control for a couple of months and actually murdered people, actually killed people. Then you have the Atlanta Autonomous Zone. Same thing. They torched the Wendy's, took it over. People were killed there. There were shootings. Yeah, I know the Wendy's Autonomous Zone is, but you know what's funny is
Hell, Wendy's.
It seems crazy to us, but this would be like saying, I don't know, people may get offended by this, but the Alamo. Right, a singular building that's seeming, is taken over. Granted, Wendy's is a chain of fast food.
Remember the Wendy's.
So now here's the important thing, real quick. The Minnesota George Floyd Autonomous Zone was up for I think 2 years.
Damn.
Where George Floyd Square was occupied to the point where there was a guy on a rooftop with a rifle.
Yeah.
That people had reported seeing all the time, and there was nothing stopping any of these people from taking this territory. Now, we may look, maybe nothing happens. Fair point on the civil rights movement. Many people thought this could lead to a second civil war. There's also, I think it was 1876, where they thought the Civil War was going to erupt again. They had the corrupt bargain. It didn't happen. We said, guys, we're not going to let it get that far. But today, what I think is different is we have militant extremist factions that have already taken over portions of cities. Maybe it doesn't go anywhere, or maybe after Trump wins, they flood these cities. If you get a state like, look, when they say when the vice president gives a press conference where she says Donald Trump is a fascist and he is Hitler, the message being sent that a lot of Republicans think is she's saying be violent or something like that. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think she's saying you as an individual must take individual action to stop Donald Trump and Republicans from gaining power in any way you can, which means I am not concerned about a Democrat cabal or the deep state funneling in 10 million fake ballots in the middle of the night. That's stupid. What I'm concerned with is 10,000 random regular people working polling locations, looking left and looking right, and then crumpling up a Trump vote and throwing it in the garbage and being like, oops. But that happens 10,000 times. That could actually shift an election in one of these key swing states. And there's nothing you can do because one individual tossing a handful of ballots is a oopsie daisies, but it happening 10,000 times is an irreconcilable conflict. Something like that could happen. And then you need only the progressive left, which makes up a small, I think 8 to 10% of the Democratic Party are the estimates, and they hate Israel, and they're going to be looking at a choice between pro-Israel and pro-Israel. They might say, Donald Trump, okay, that's it, we're out. We're autonomous zoning. And then you get urban level conflict, which is a civil strife period, perhaps. Like you were saying, Rudyard, that there could be bombs going off in Chicago. How do we get to 1,000 dead by April? I kind of feel like that might be a little over the top. I don't know if we're anywhere.
1,000's really low for a war. It could be way worse.
But I'm saying it's like, I don't know that we're at the point where we have enough tinder to spark the war in the immediate, but I could be totally wrong. I think maybe it's just normalcy bias or optimism bias where I'm like, I think there's got to be periods of, we had a caning in the Senate, and it wasn't even immediately after that people were fighting. We had 7 years of bleeding Kansas. This could ignite the bleeding Kansas phase, I suppose. That being said, before Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated, 7 states seceded from the Union. It may just be the fact that this election is so contentious, groups instantly rise up saying, we will not accept this.
Yeah.
And you immediately move into that pre-Civil War phase.
I can explain the exact context for why I think it's going to happen now, but I'll need to talk for a little bit because it's multiple points. So the first one is what I described before, that the Republicans can't handle another 4 years of Biden because inflation and immigration. The Democrats in the reverse, and this is one of the big things that got me onto thinking that we're going to have a war, is the left has burned through all of their social capital and they have no backup plan. This is one of the things I've been studying for years, and it's bizarre. You look at the leftist-owned organizations like Disney, like California, like, I don't know, half a dozen other things
All
in
of
media.
California.
Exactly, yeah.
The record labels.
Yeah, California is
Colleges.
to states what Disney and Bud Light is to businesses. And the Democrats have burned through all of their social capital. And whenever I look at leftist institutions, I am completely shocked at their incompetence. And the problem is that they've boxed themselves into a corner. And I find the Kamala situation to be beautiful because the left is eating their own grave, where they dug their own grave and now they're forced to
Eat it.
Eat it.
Yeah, I realized that went poorly. I was going to say eat crow, and then I changed the
Well, they're eating
metaphor.
dirt. Yeah, it'll work.
Eat dirt.
Yeah, so they're eating their own grave, and they have no better plan. And the problem is they're controlled by insane DEI hire radicals. Just as an example, the fact that Boeing is operating off DEI hires is an example to me that things are about to go to head, where because if the left was purely cynical, they'd think, oh, the industries like DEI and the medical industry will keep the competent white guys in there. But no, they genuinely believe this stuff. So it will cause social breakdown. So the Republicans have that issue. The Democrats are in a problem where they've cut out all dissenters, and at the same time, their institutions are dead and can't survive. So the left will want to start a war as a way to get out of their own internal issues, which is incredibly common historically. So that's one angle of it, the right and the left self-interest. The other angle of it is that the average American is careening very close to bankruptcy now. And if you look at the average American savings, they built them up during COVID and they're about to hit bankruptcy. And the economic issues, the thing that I can't overstate on every single one of these podcasts is how completely miserable the average American is, economically, socially, on a variety of different metrics. And about 20% of Americans are doing better, 80% are doing vastly worse. And I don't think the average American can sustain another 4 years of this. And it's going to keep piling up, and there's not going to be a solution until there is a war, because the problems that make life so hard for the average American are, I'm going to make a video how boomer bureaucracies are destroying America. Because I think the most dangerous thing to America and the West is the creation of these boomer bureaucracies that just consume everything as they continue to try to support the boomers without the population structure they were invented with. And so you have the right and the left in positions of desperation. You have the average American in positions of desperation. And also, we just have no cards left as a society. We've burned. So, let's say you had a horrible breakup and you're drinking to get over the breakup, and then you become an alcoholic. That's what we are, where we've every single short-term strategy we would have done, whether money printing, whether burning old social, because we don't make new movies, we don't make new music. We've burned through all of our old social capital, and now there's no good new movies or music. So we've burned through all of the cards we would use to delay this. And I frankly think over the period we're talking about right now, so many Americans have been pushed into poverty and bankruptcy that they're just going to say, YOLO, and I want there to be a civil war because that way there's going to be a debt jubilee.
Well, so I asked our good AI friend to make the average, make a graph showing the average American savings over the past 10 years adjusted for inflation. And you can see that we are now below 2014 levels as of today. But it's not, what's interesting to me is not that it's comparable to 2014. It's the massive drop off from 2020 to 2020, that's 2023, existing data.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because, okay, well, we're only as bad as we were in 2014, right? But imagine how someone feels, and feelings matter more than what is.
The thing that doesn't cover is cost of living, where cost of living has skyrocketed since 2014 to an insane degree. Housing, food, and And the last time I was on this show, I was talking about the Great Wave and the economic patterns used to predict conflicts like this. And it's high resource price, high food price, high real estate, economic bull runs, massive government budget that keeps surging. And what I've consistently found is that our budget is ridiculous. We're never going to repay it. We have to come to terms with the fact that America will end up becoming a bankrupt country. And so it's only a matter of time before we default on the debt. And there's no way to default on the debt without a political crisis. And this is how most of those previous historic crises took place, because you have to get rid of the debt. And the way you get rid of the debt is by changing the government, so the new government's not responsible for the old government.
This is wild.
It makes sense.
Cost of living by dollars is so high that it's hard to actually even track the average savings.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's cutting into the savings because people have far less to save.
I live this.
But
I don't need to see this.
Yeah.
So you can see the average cost of living has gone from 2014 at about $50,000 a year to around, it looks like $65,000 a year, while the average savings has been declining. So this is actually an interesting point. Where this goes or how this changes, I don't know, but it does show that at least in the past decade, people have not been accumulating savings. They've been burning through savings.
Yes.
That is to say that it's like watching, your cell phone is plugged in and you're using it, and it is charging, but still dying because you're using more. It's
Yes.
Don't you hate when that happens too? You're like, it's plugged in, but it's like not charging.
Yeah, I've had that issue. The thing with civil wars that no one brings up, and I'm glad you teased this point out of me because it's important, but I would never say it without that intro, is the reason people have civil wars is they provide very good plausible deniability for a variety of things. If you are envious of your wealthier neighbor and you want to take their stuff, civil war. If you're bankrupt and you don't want to pay back your loans, civil war. If you won't get reelected in your district due to leftist competition, civil war. Civil war is just a get out of jail free card for a variety of things that are difficult to deal with. You could say, like, the medical industry is a tapeworm that consumes America, and you could just say civil war. Goodbye, medical industry. Doctors, you train for 3 years, not 10 now. Civil war is in a very cynical sense, is a get out of jail free card for, yes.
Just look.
Yeah, I live.
I made a new graph.
I'm aware.
This is average income compared with the average cost of living by dollars.
Yeah, this is my entire social network.
And this is really something. In 2014, the income was just about what? We're looking at $13,000 above the cost of living, meaning on average, people were saving or had to a certain degree of disposable income. We are at the point now where people are struggling to get by. There's no disposable income. On average, this country is paycheck to paycheck. I can give you a real simple human equation. If the cost of water ever exceeds the wages earned, your society it's civil war. Period. And this is not a real it's not a real world metric. What I'm saying is, you see those videos we were talking about a couple weeks ago where there's like a lion and a gazelle and they're both drinking from the watering hole and they're like, no, we're not fighting here. Because the lions are like, everybody's got to have water. And the alligators are crocodiles they got down there, not alligators.
Yeah.
They'll snatch you up. But the animals will be at the watering hole and it's like truce. Because if at any point there's stress where we cannot get water, we're done. Yeah, we're going to go fight when we're in the plains. But the thing about water is, I was thinking about this because of Flint. The cost of water became so great, people fled. There was an opportunity to go somewhere else. People talk about the three factors that result in revolution or civil war. It's do you have food, do you have security, and I forgot what the last one. Do you know what the three factors were? This came out bigly during the Arab Spring when there were the questions were being asked why all of these countries went and had revolutions. And one of the factors was the cost of food. And I think security/shelter is one of them too. But the cost of food was too high. So people were working really, really hard and they still couldn't afford all of the calories they needed to live. And so they just get to the point where they say, I don't want to die. I need food. Chaos ensues.
Yeah.
The example in Tunisia was, what was the guy's name? Was it Mohamed Bouazizi? I could be getting it wrong. He was a fruit cart vendor and police came up to him and said, you are not legally allowed to sell fruit. And he says, I am going to die if I don't make money. And they stopped him and said, no more selling fruit. So he went in front of a government building, set himself on fire in protest saying, I can't live anymore. I'm done. And this ignited the Tunisian revolution, which I believe sparked the entirety of the Arab Spring. It's spread all across the region. Looking at this map, seeing that the cost of living is about to slam into the average income, this means that people will be working as hard as they possibly can, and they will not be making enough to live. At a certain point after that, a human being says, the only way I can get my resources is through extra legal means. The system has failed. That's a worrying point. I should say we're at a worrying point because this data ends 2023 and we are almost done with 2024. So I can only assume if we extrapolate the data, we may be at the inflection point where people can't afford anymore. I work 40 hours a week and I'm losing money. I'm burning savings. That's why savings is going down. How will I feed my family next year?
Yeah.
It could be simple. Trump wins. Everybody cheers and says maybe Trump will turn things around, and they're willing to wait for a year, file for government benefits or whatever in the meantime, and see if things turn around. It's possible that Trump turns things around to such a degree that we alleviate any serious crisis.
This is the reality we live with now. And it's funny that I've gone on a lot of podcasts talking about the Civil War. And this is one of those things I really have to hammer into most podcast hosts. And they just don't get it, where most Americans, 80% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck now. 40% of Americans have less than $400 in savings. 70% have less than $1,000 of savings. And it's something people are completely disconnected to. But the average American can't make it another 4 years because there's no countervening force to this. And when you look at the world, you'll see a measure and you think, what's the pressure against that? Because the pressure against that can often equalize it or push it back. And there's no force in America that's actively pushing against that trend. There's no, because if AI is the big advance I see recently, and AI is not going to help normal Americans.
It's going to make it worse.
Exactly. Yeah.
What we're already seeing with, well, let me put it this way. You cannot live working at Taco Bell.
Yeah.
It's not possible. When I was 18, I worked at O'Hare, and I remember why I quit, because I was in massive debt. I generated about $1,000 in credit card debt because if I wanted to eat to live and have gas to drive to work, I was using my credit cards.
Yeah.
But then when my paycheck would come in, I'd be like, okay, shoes. I have one pair of shoes and they're fried. If I want to buy a pair of shoes, if I want to pay my car insurance, if I want to get my registration, all the things I got to do, my paycheck is down to almost nothing, but I have to eat. And so then it looks like gas is coming on the credit card. Then I have to pay the minimum balance on the credit card, but then the balance goes up.
Yeah.
Eventually, after 6-7 months, I worked there for 2 years. It got to a point where I said, I'm working, I was working probably like 40, 50 hours a week. I was picking up extra shifts. I was working overtime and doing doubles trying to make money. And I'm like, unless I work here 80 hours a week, I can't actually pay for gas, buy food, and live. I have no health insurance. I was sleeping on a friend's couch, and I'm like, this is not possible. It's an impossibility. So if you're at Taco Bell right now and you're like, I am working as hard as I can, and no offense, Taco Bell, we like Taco Bell. I'm just saying they don't pay enough. And I think it's government factors that play a role in this. But let's just say you're working a standard entry level minimum wage job. Now they're going to replace you with a kiosk. And they've already done it. The Taco Bell over here, you walk in, it's 4 kiosks.
Yeah.
You walk up and you just go boop, boop, boop. And then there's two guys in the back making the food. They walk up and go, number 54. You don't need a cashier anymore. You just have only a couple of people. They've dramatically reduced the amount of people who have jobs. So now you're going to have an increasing number of people trying to file for benefits. Now we're looking at another equation. The amount of buying power and resources put into the U.S. system, welfare base, is going to become less than the amount of people extracting from it. The deficit will skyrocket. The debt will skyrocket. And then eventually, the people who are working are like, 80% of my revenue is going towards people who don't have jobs. I talked about this a really long time ago pertaining to automation and the dangers of automation. I'm not a Luddite. I think automation is a good thing, but it has to be properly managed. If we get to the point where we say, hey, you don't need fast food workers anymore, let's do UBI. This is a big push that I remember going back to Occupy, where people said we should have universal basic income because automation is replacing a lot of the labor. So now everybody should have a bare minimum access to these things. Yes, that's right. So the guy who lives in the city and no longer works at Taco Bell, but still gets the equivalent of minimum wage at 40 hours a week, is going to be sitting in his living room enjoying life. And let's say he's a very upstanding citizen. He goes to church every Sunday. There's going to be a farmer who's going to say, why do I have to work 40 hours a week to make the food this guy gets for free? I refuse. You will always have, unless, and I don't think there's a way to properly manage it, a situation where someone has to do work and someone else does not with automation. And that is another recipe for civil war.
Yes. What you're talking about is the same calculation as aging. And sadly, both of them are hitting us at the exact same time, where aging will naturally end up in an issue where you have a small young population working to support a large elderly population. And the young population will get intensely resentful about that, especially if you look at the boomers have done very financially well for their whole life. And so you're asking Zoomers who have basically been screwed over their whole lives to support the boomers' retirements. And so that's going to end up becoming a massive issue. And
oh, bro, they're going to say no.
Yeah, exactly. And the Zoomers are going to have the military power too, because they'll be the people with the guns in the army. And so that's going to get ugly.
Well, I don't know if I agree.
Yeah.
Boomers are going to control the military because of their accumulation of base assets, right? So you take a look at like Venezuela. You're going to have a 25-year-old National Guardsman, and the boomer is going to say, we control the bank accounts, we control the flow of resources. If you want to feed your family, you're going to work for me. And they're going to say, okay. But you will have revolutionary Zoomers who are going to say, I am done doing labor for you. And that's when you get this impasse. Currently, I think the estimate is between 2.8 and 4 workers to cover the cost of one Social Security recipient. So as we have an aging population and a depopulation at the same time, this is another reason I think Democrats want to bring in as many illegal immigrants as possible to bolster the tax base.
Yeah.
Because if you get to that point, which they're estimating 2032, where Social Security becomes insolvent and they can only pay out what goes into it, there's going to be a lot of very angry boomers and older Gen Xers who are going to be saying, I paid into this. I deserve it. It's mine. And they're going to say, except due to the cost of living increase and inflation, you've paid into at 1 times and you need 2.8 to 4 times to pay you back. Now you're asking young people to do labor for you. There's no answer there.
Yeah.
The conflict becomes powerful elites who control structures and can influence and guarantee food and resources to younger people who fight and younger people who fight.
Yes.
No, I totally agree on the generational conflict matter, but I don't know if we will have a civil war between the boomers in the villages versus the blue-haired Zoomers. Maybe we could have that, but I do agree with your point that whoever pays the military, that's who they're going to serve. And it's going to be the boomers and Gen Xers serving them. But on the automation, I actually have to give some defense of automation because a lot of these jobs that are going to be replaced by automation, that's what we're bringing in the illegals and immigrants to do. I mean, I don't know about the local Taco Bell, but you can go to a lot of Taco Bells, even off the interstate in rural areas, and you'll see somebody who barely speaks English at that job. And you'd probably be, actually, I'd much rather have an AI kiosk to help me there. And that would also, a lot of these people, if they're like, they don't have a job, then they'll go back to Guatemala. So I think actually there are a lot of Americans who are hurt by this, but a lot of the Americans who are hurt are already on the welfare system as is. Now, there's some things that negative that would be impacted, but there's other things that would be positively impacted. Now, on the point of the economic problems, I mean, we've had several severe economic problems throughout our history. You know, throughout the 19th century, Panic of 1837, elsewhere, there was times where people had all their savings wiped out and they could no longer feed themselves. And this was even the case in the Great Depression. People were legitimately starving. The thing about America is that our poorest people are able to be obese, that they're eating too much. And they don't have to worry about food and water. Now, they do have to worry about where they're going to sleep at night and this, but they'll also even have iPhones and all these trinkets that, you know, the poor people who are literally starving in Africa could never dream of. And going to your point about the, you know, with the debt, individual people having debt and all these problems, and then civil war solving that, but that's on the individual level. An individual himself cannot start a civil war. It has to be a large group. And so if a large group, you know, it'd have to be like a state of something, you know, a sizable amount of people, millions of people who all have the same problem, and then saying, okay, this civil war, we're starting that. And generally, if you look at past conflicts, it's either that they feel that their rights are being denied, or that they would like independence for their spot of land, or that there was this grave insult that the majority population of the government paid to their culture of some sort, then they would go along with it. But when these individual problems, bankruptcy or whatever, or a lot of these solutions for these individual problems is bankruptcy, but you're suggesting it's actually civil war is the better solution for those problems.
I mean, bankruptcy doesn't solve that you can't feed your 2 small children.
True, but I think in America, pretty much, I mean, the thing is that people find a way to feed their children, whether it's food stamps or anything. We have such a system that we don't really have to worry about the mass starvation of a level that we did in the 19th century.
And I agree with that. My point is saying that when we get to the level where more people have to pay into benefits and do work, when the majority is receiving these benefits, the system is inverted and it can't sustain itself. Then you're gonna find perhaps it's a simple economic collapse. It doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to go start fighting, but it does mean the system is shattered.
Yeah, it could be a collapse. I think a collapse is a better way of saying it, but we don't know what would happen afterwards. I mean, it'd probably be roving bands of gangs. It's like the Roman Empire with these war bands around. The fall of the Roman Empire is basically MS-13 and Hell's Angels and these gangs just fighting it out over the remnants.
The factor that I believe is on top of all of this is that with all of these issues we are describing, not one single one being a guarantee of civil war, you have to factor in that there are 2 distinct moral worldviews between the right and the left. And when these problems, when the system collapses, when there's an inversion, when you look at the willingness to engage in violence from the left already, then you basically have not one moment, but you have ingredients in a single cauldron, which could be civil war. And again, that's why I'm saying I don't know that I agree. I don't agree that by April it's 1,000 dead people. That being said, the Summer of Love was something like 36 deaths. And that was a period of 4 days. Yeah. So if we get something like that sustained every 4 days, 30 plus deaths, I don't know, we're going to get to 1,000, but we'll certainly have hundreds.
A couple of things. The first is we're acting as if the historic record doesn't exist, but the reality is the historic record's the only thing we actually have to study. And if they look at the historic record, war is completely normal. If you want to bet over someone's life whether or not there'll be a major war, you should always bet there's going to be a major war in every lifetime. And keep in mind, the bloodiest events in history all occurred within living memory. People who fought in World War II are still and lived through Stalinism and Nazism are still alive today. So we're not better people than we were 70 years ago. And war is
how many
really
of those
normal.
wars have happened within Western Europe and the homeland of America? We've had wars several all throughout the Third World, but how many of those wars have taken place in the West?
World War II.
Real quick, sorry, I did some math. If you're saying that by April there will be 1,000 dead, is it fair to say you're including the month of April in that equation?
Yes.
Like, let's say the end of April?
Yes.
If starting today we had a Summer of Love style level of violence and has to start today until the end of April, that would be 1,645 deaths. So if we were to cut that by 1/3 and remove 2 months from the equation and start from the end of December, then Rudyard's estimate makes sense if we get Summer of Love level of violence in December.
1,000 deaths is also nothing. It's difficult to convey that point, but you look at war, and let's say there's a very basic supply chain breakdown. Even stuff like you can't get medical equipment for a few weeks. That's millions of deaths because of millions of people are reliant upon very complex medical systems. If the port of Los Angeles gets blockaded for a few weeks,
that's who's blockading it.
So
let me finish the point.
I'm sorry, I got to pause you.
Yeah.
I did the math.
Yeah.
I asked ChatGPT if we were trying to, I said, assuming that the end of April is the end of this calculation,
Yeah.
on what day would violence have to begin in order to reach 1,000 deaths by April? And do you know what that date was? January 6, 2025.
Let's see what the fates say.
Yeah, what? That I did not see
might
coming.
have a prophet here.
I mean, the way war works is, and we're acting as if the world is mathematical and reasonable and rational, and the world really isn't. World War I, there were no deaths, and then 500,000 men died in a few hours. And if there's a war, and we forget how big population numbers are, we could easily have 20 million deaths because you starve out certain cities, you bomb certain areas. people keep in mind the part of Germany where my ancestors were from the 30 Years' War, 80% of their population died. Stuff like that's not unreasonable because supply chains are so interdependent and complex. You could very easily have cities starve. People would have no food. They'd have no idea how to forage. Medical equipment's incredibly a lot of people have medical conditions that require very complex supply chains. It's very easy to have lots of people die. And you look at the world wars, again, in living memory, 40 million people died in the Eastern Front. I don't think things will get that ugly, but 1,000 deaths is nothing. That's like a single charge for a single front of infantry in a battle. That's 1,000 deaths in a handful of hours, or even you could have 1,000 deaths, a single front of a battle in a half an hour period. This is what the world wars were.
Yeah, I think if you were having the type of riots we were having in the late 60s, 1,000 could be reasonable. I mean, because, these cities throughout the country in 67, 68 were basically going under an insurrection and hundreds were dying. I think, like 100 died in Detroit and New York. So if you do have that situations, you could have that. But even in our mass riots we had in 2020, where we had 36 die, but there were far more riots and it was everywhere. It was still very bad. I'm not trying to downplay the summer of 2020, but it was less bad than what it was in 68, where, the type of violence that was being able to commit was more even back then. Now, this could change. Maybe this happens after the election in 2024, but who would be committing this violence? And the people who would be most worked up about the election, say if Trump wins, would be middle-aged cat ladies. It would not be the urban population that you need that were waging this insurrection back in the late 60s. And even now when people go up and there's enough man on the street interviews with local blacks in Chicago and Detroit, and they're like, I like Trump. They're like, I don't know if those people are going to be rioting.
But that's not real.
Their votes aren't real, but I just don't think that they're not that angry about
these
Trump.
videos are not including the Kamala voters. They're intentionally asking 10 people and then showing the 5 Trump voters.
I think the majority of those areas are 100% going for Kamala. And a lot of those guys who are saying they're voting for Trump, their ballot has already been cast for Kamala. But I'm just saying that they don't seem that upset by Trump. That's my main point.
But understand, you're talking about selectively edited videos to make a point where, and I've talked about, there was one recently that went viral where it's a guy working at a gas station and he asked the young black men coming in, who are you voting for? And you can see in the background, there are other people, but for some reason never appear in his video because he's showing the Trump supporters. And it's fine if you want to say, look at these black men I met who want to support Trump, but they're not including the Harris voters, which is the overwhelming majority in those areas. Additionally, just because there are cat ladies who overwhelmingly vote in one direction doesn't mean it's reasonable to assume they'd be the ones fighting.
Well, they were the ones that were protested immediately after Trump.
That's meaningless.
Won in 2016.
What matters is control of assets and the means to control a young person who is capable or willing to fight. Then there's also, if you live in, this is interesting. When you look at that movie Civil War that came out earlier in the year, the map they drew shows West Virginia as part of the federal apparatus. Well, that didn't make sense, right? Why would West Virginia? Because West Virginia is territorially locked and would be conquered in 2 seconds. Now, to be fair, West Virginia probably would not be conquered in 2 seconds because it's mountainous and very hard to move through and gain control of. But because of its proximity to D.C., it's going to be left. It's going to be Democrat. West Virginia is the second most Trump-supporting state in the country, but it's going to be one of the first moves made by federal authorities in the event of any kind of state dispute. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. I'm saying that's why the movie predicted West Virginia would be aligned with Virginia and Maryland because of proximity. So my point there is cat ladies are going to sit there and complain, and then they're going to vote, and the politicians are going to say, these are the allocation of resources. Then there's going to be a bunch of Zoomers who are like, look, man, I'm in the National Guard and I live in Maryland and they're ordering me to do this. Cat lady's not fighting. Yeah. It's the young people that they send to fight.
Well, it depends. It's the point I was bringing up is like who is doing the fighting, who's taking to the streets, and who's committing the acts of violence. Now, as I want to make the point, I don't think young black men are a majority or even a significant number of them, besides 10, 15 or 20% are actually voting for Trump. I just think that they're not that energized enough to commit the acts of violence. And I would say it's probably similar with young Hispanic men. Civil wars are young men's game. So you have to find some demographic of young men capable of committing violence and doing bad things out in the street. And right now, I don't think the left has that element. So if Trump wins, it would be, once again, a replay of the Women's March that happened in 2016, which the women in the pussy hats are just not going to be toppling much of anything. And I don't even know if Trump voters are going to do the same thing if he's declared the loser, because they're worried of what happened after January 6th, and they don't want that to happen to them.
If you look at it like the pussy hat wearing women are the establishment neo-lib neocons that have at right now control of large police departments, I don't understand why we'd ever make the argument that they'd go around smashing things. If the conflict arises where you have the Nancy Pelosi, right? She was saying she wanted, what did she want? Full auto 50 cal turrets or something?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, it was something insane where it's like, you can't put that in DC. Like the buildings would be just lit. It's insane. But she has no idea. She wouldn't be fighting, nor would any of the people who vote for her. But they control DC law enforcement and force apparatus.
And that was seen in January 6th. I mean, that's, it wasn't the cat ladies going around arresting all these guys. It was sending out, the FBI and SWAT teams.
And so what did we see in 2018 that it ignited the first conversations of a potential civil war? It was 1,000 right-wing men and 1,000 left-wing men fighting in the streets of the Pacific Northwest and beating each other with clubs. Or in Boston, when Antifa showed up with crowbars and baseball bats and masks, and the right showed up with shields and military-style looking clothing. I say looking clothing because they're basically wearing like body armor and camo, but it probably wasn't even real body armor. People were clashing with each other. It doesn't need to be 50-50. I mean, the estimates given during the American Revolution in that famous letter, I can't remember who wrote it. It might have been John Adams or something. It's not real numbers, but he said 1/3 are for it, 1/3 are against it, and 1/3 don't care. That's not actually what the real numbers were. But the estimates were that it was a plurality that did not care. It was a large portion that wanted revolution and a smaller portion that were loyalists. So the people who did not care were like, I don't know what's going on. And a war broke out. And this meant that people who didn't care had their homes occupied by British regulars or by either faction. And just as an aside, there's a literal declaration of dependence. I think it's Always Sunny in Philadelphia made a joke where they were going to write a declaration of dependence. Yeah, the loyalists in New York drafted a declaration of dependence saying we support the crown. But anyway, I digress. My point is, I think you brought this up, Rudyard, that like Bolsheviks were like 3% of Russia.
Yeah. As I was going to say, we're acting like the historic record doesn't exist, but it does. And everything we're seeing now is completely normal in a society up to a civil war. And you've asked me multiple times who would fight. And if you look at these historic crises, most people are apathetic, especially so in wars outside America where most people are just peasants who farm. And then the Lord tells them what to do. And in the English Civil War, which is one of the closest parallels, it was widely known in England that the English were too weak to fight because it had been over a century since England had had a war. What happened then is that in each case, it's small groups of radicals that push for this. The Bolsheviks, the Jacobins, all these groups are like less than 3% of the population. And then they push their interests. And for the right, there's lots of young men who would happily fight for the right because the left has boxed them into a corner. And for the left, both sides would conscript people because when the government walks up to your door and says your son's going to fight for us, you can't tell them no. And the left would probably arm illegals because that's a demographic they could pull from. They'd hire foreign mercenaries and arm illegals. But this is why I've said in my videos, the right has an 80% chance of winning because the right provides much better incentives for the young men who would fight.
But let's not erase all of this. Let's say that there is it is a fact. The left and the right are at extreme odds in this country. Whether it goes to civil war, who knows? China, Iran, Russia, and in fact, all of BRICS has an incentive for this conflict to happen, which would end the petrodollar, basically destroy the United States, and allow the BRICS reserve currency to take over. In every conflict, let's go to the American Revolution, you had outside financiers. So we say, haha, the French intervened and helped us win our independence. Not really. The French intervened because they were already at war with Britain, and they were like, hey, these guys will help us fight. So for them, it was like, yeah, let's go to war. And then I love asking British folk how they view the American Revolution. And I was talking to Carl Benjamin, and he's like, mate, that was like 20 years in our 1,000-year history. It's like, we mention it a little bit, but the bigger picture was the wars happening in Europe, not you guys. He's like, I understand for you, it's your entire identity. But for us, it was one small component of an ongoing war that's been happening for some time. And I'm like, it's a really good point. My point here is, let's say there's not a strong enough appetite for a real civil war. certainly you will see external forces trying to make that happen, as I believe they are now. Why wouldn't they be? And then if it got to the point where there was a pile of tinder, China's going to march right in and try and figure out how to light it up.
Yeah. I find that with who is the force pushing for American unity? Because there's lots of forces pushing for disunity, but I see no single unifying thing in America. There's no one thing all Americans can agree on.
Social Security.
I don't agree on that. I'm going to have to pay that crap and I'll
Well,
never take it.
I don't agree with it either.
We have, it's clearly a joke, but we do have these services that everyone takes part of. I mean, we all like roads. Most people like the military. We all like the safety and security that the American state provides. But I would say the uniting factor would be the state itself, even though the state is up for grabs, is the state has a desire to not go towards disunity and chaos, as we saw in the aftermath of the election last time, where they came down hard on Trump supporters over the overblown fear that somehow they're going to wage a coup or something, even though it was people going around the Capitol taking selfies. They came down that hard because they thought that was a threat, and that could potentially spiral into disunity. And as long as the federal state is extremely strong, which it is, it's much stronger than it was in the 1860s, and it's even much stronger than it was in the 1960s, it's going to keep this together. Now, if that collapsed or was weakened, say, China takes Taiwan and we lost in that war or conflict over it, that could be a weakening of the state, and that could delegitimize it, and then people could be trying to break off, and then something like a civil war happens.
There's no legitimacy in the state. When you poll average Americans, they hate the state. The state is like a 20% approval rate. My question to you is, if a civil war were to happen, what would it look like? What evidence would you need to see in the real world to know that there would be a civil war?
I would have to see two clear sides, and I would have to see, it would have to be some types of battles, at least with people, two different sides fighting over cities. It might not be like a traditional war. It might be more guerrilla war or something like we saw in the Troubles in Northern Ireland, but it could be something along those regards. I need to see two clear sides.
So let me ask real quick. How many factions were in the Syrian civil war? How many sides were there?
Well, there were several, and there's several factions in the Lebanese civil war. Let me rephrase this. There would have to be sides where people are fighting lethally, using lethal amounts of violence with guns, with traditional military weaponry.
So what you're saying is, when a civil war starts, you will agree there's a civil war.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, I think it'd have to be, even something like the Lebanese civil war, the Syrian civil war, where there's like a dozen different factions. There are battles occurring over cities where there are fights between either two or multiple sides over a city, and that's occurring.
So what evidence do you need to believe we are on track for a civil war?
That there are...
No. That was you saying, if a civil war happens, I will agree there's a civil war. What needs to be happening in a country for you to think, hey, a civil war might happen?
There'd have to be like a bleeding Kansas, or something that people are willing to use violence even to get to lay a lethal. It might not be like they're actually fighting for control over a city, but say the left has an insurrection in Seattle, and then they fight with police and soldiers there. And maybe it doesn't rise to the way of war, but it shows that this could be replicated.
Wait. But do you think that in the American Civil War, like the citizens of Atlanta were fighting the Georgian government?
No, but I'm saying that...
why would the left fight themselves in their own city?
I'm saying if they tried to declare the Seattle independent of the United States, that the state would come down hard on them.
Why would they? Wait, I'm just trying to clarify this. In Seattle, when they took over the Chaz for a couple of months and murdered people, took over a police station, the government largely agreed with them and let them do it. So it's like saying there's got to be two factions.
I'm just pointing out a hypothetical here.
But hold on, right. So the clarification is, a civil war requires some sides. But why would they be fighting themselves? I don't understand what you're trying to say. Like, why would leftist progressives in a leftist progressive state fight themselves? Wouldn't they want to fight, say, Nebraska or
you could say, you could go this to say Atlanta, or you can say any other city. I'm just saying that, say you have leftists in a city that launch an insurrection against the city government or the state, and then the federal, and they're saying we're now an independent city of Atlanta or Seattle. But if the Chaz then tried to take over the city and then say we're independent of the United States government, There would be lethal force to come down.
Wait, hold up. So I'm confused. In the American Civil War in and the American Civil War is not indicative of every other civil war, but I'm just saying, like, in Georgia, they weren't walking out of the houses and going, I hate the Georgian government, I'm going to declare independence from my own state. They were saying the other people over there are bad. So if Seattle, as a group, says we're going to defy federal law and we're going to ignore federal authority, which they've been doing, I don't understand why your prerequisite is that they have to fight themselves. Like, the people in Seattle who took over and shut the police down were largely politically aligned. Wheeler himself came out and joined them in protest in Portland. It was Portland, right? He was with them as they were rioting and protesting and firebombing a federal building.
Yeah.
Like that. Why are they going to fight themselves?
I think you might be a little too focused on the fact that it's Washington and Seattle. I'm just saying this is a theoretical, hypothetical.
Why would any city fight? It's like,
there's a couple of red states where they would fight.
But that's not a civil war. You're saying like a protest in a city.
I'm not saying that this is a civil war. I'm saying that things like this would need to happen to show like the sides.
So when in a civil war did a city fight its own territory? Like, when in a civil war did like in the Spanish Civil War, you had the Nationalists and the Republicans, and they controlled urban and rural areas. When in that civil war did the Nationalists in their own territory fight themselves?
I'm using the example of just saying that this would happen is that it's creating a political revolution.
Okay, no. We're bumping into a wall. My point is this. Let's pick any jurisdiction. Let's call it the state of statehood. Doesn't need to be anywhere. The people who live in statehood overwhelmingly vote a certain way, have a certain ideology, and believe in it. Why would it need to be that they fight themselves for it to be evidence of a civil war coming? When in a civil war has an isolated jurisdiction of shared ideology decided to declare war on itself?
I was using the example, but here's what I was trying to say. So I'm going to take it back that we're focused on Seattle. Washington's a very blue state.
I'm washing that of anything. I'm saying why would any faction fight itself before a civil war is to begin?
They would be different factions. That's what I was arguing. Because let's say that it's left rising up against the federal government, and so it could be anywhere in this country. I'm just pointing out that this is the left and saying that the federal government, maybe the state of Washington decides to go along with the left, or maybe they decide to go with the federal government. I'm just pointing out that example is that if it's one locality that rises up against the federal government for either the right or the left, the sides that I would say, there could be multiple other sides being formed afterwards, but they're rising up against the federal government. It'd be like in the Syrian Civil War, where they're rising up against the government, and then many other factions began to form.
Like in the Pacific Northwest, when I think it was something like 110 days, where far leftists were throwing explosives at the federal building surrounding it, and the building was shut down. Federal authorities were trapped inside. Trump called in numerous different federal law enforcement, but the government of Portland, the local government, sided with the far left extremists who were firebombing a building.
Yeah, and that would be a sign that the local government is then siding with the left, that escalated past that into that they're trying to take over the entirety of Portland, and then Portland city government is like, oh, we're siding with them. They would have to choose whether they side with the left. But I want to put this out that I don't think this is likely. I'm just saying this is a possible scenario.
So do you believe that if an ideological faction in a city started trying to take over or destroy a federal building in defiance of federal authority and fought with federal authorities and the state sided with them, would that be a civil war?
No, but it could be a sign of a possible civil war that arises that's happening elsewhere, and then that begins to escalate into they're trying to take over the city.
You think that would...
It would have to be taking over like Chaz in this incident. If there's like tons of Chaz's taking over, and then Chaz tries to expand to take over the city, I would say that that's a warning sign of something that could happen with a civil war.
So if a large group of, say, leftists had an autonomous zone that they controlled, like the size of Chaz, and people had already been killed, but if Chaz then started to expand, that makes you think maybe a civil war could happen.
Maybe if they're trying to take over the city and that they have many, many allies across the country and that there's a sizable part of the population that agrees with them. People were misled into thinking these are just peaceful protesters, but if you ask American people and they're like, do you support the left-wing autonomous or whatever they want to call themselves taking over the entire state of Washington and declaring themselves independent of the United States government, and then like 20-30% of the population is like yes, then you have a chance of that there's some type of secession or civil war happening. But I don't believe this is happening. And even with Chaz, that's a disturbing element that we could see more of. But it's almost like the no-go zones that you see in Europe with the, Islamic neighborhoods just sprouting up and it's being ruled effectively by Sharia law. Instead, we have leftist no-go zones.
Well, they're very different. So
you could see something of that sort.
I've gone to some of these areas. I went to Sweden. I think I was in, where was I? Belgium. I went to Europe. I went to France. I went to Germany. And these no-go zones are nothing like what we saw with Chaz Chop. Chaz, they murdered people. They unloaded. There was one story where they unloaded for about 10 minutes, hundreds of rounds into a white SUV, just because it was a violation of their territory. And they said they assumed they were told it was white supremacists.
There are gang-run territories where they kill a lot of people in America.
Not like that. I'm from Chicago, and I can tell you what Chicago's like. So having a conversation, well, actually, I don't want to put anybody in danger.
Are you saying that in gang-run territories, if a rival gang goes in there, that they won't shoot up the vehicle?
So you're saying that a regular person walking into the Chaz is a rival gang?
I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that there are territories, even in America, which
let me tell you that even in Chicago, the idea that there would be a sectioned off area with security guards, barriers, and a police station that was completely taken over, and that men with rifles would unload for 10 minutes, hundreds of rounds into SUVs, and there were other people who were murdered in Chicago, that's unheard of. In Chicago, you have honor, I would call it respect and honor killings, where you disrespect me, they go get revenge. A lot of people think it's gang related. It's really about disrespect. Guy goes on social media and smack talks a guy, says his girl's ugly. He's going to go to your house and there's going to be a drive-by. It's jurisdictionless. Certainly gangs have territory where they sell things like this, but that's why I give a warning to a lot of people with Chicago. You're not safe anywhere in Chicago. There's no jurisdictional boundaries. When the Chaz Chop happened, stay out of the Chaz Chop. There's a barrier where guys are standing there with rifles from the John Brown Gun Club or whatever, and these people killed a guy. They killed a guy. There was a young black man who was shot and killed. We don't know why. And then there was the white SUV incident. There were a few others. This is substantially different from gangland violence.
It is different. I mean, the fact that they do have border guards, but there is a way that there's a different law governing those areas than what's the normal law. And it's would be even the same in Sharia law. And there could be something of these sorts where I think if they actually had armed border guards and try to do an exact replica of Chaz, where it's like there's in some ways an understanding that they're separate from the rest of the city and they're separate from the country, there would be more of a force put on them to end that. But there could be these areas where essentially the left have their own autonomous commune and that they're running it the way they see fit, and then police are just know not to go there.
So when I went to Sweden, they loved it. When I first arrived, I met with this Green Party politician who's like a liberal, and I said, "Tell me what's going on in this country." And he laid out his case. They loved it. Huffington Post said, Tim Pool does a great report. And then, because I was doing journalism, I said, now let's go to these areas they say are bad. And boy, did they lose their mind when I went to Rinkeby. They had no problem when I went to Rosengard, where I saw a bunch of beautiful apartments. There were many Muslims. People were waving and smiling. I went to the grocery store. I bought food. I feared nothing. I went to an apartment, met a young couple, and I said, this apartment is better than most apartments in Chicago. And they were all laughing, saying, you see, all this is overblown. Then I went to Rinkeby, and this is a no-go zone in nowhere near how bad Chaz was. But this is the extreme moment. What happened was Somali migrants, refugees came into the country in the 90s. They had kids. Those kids were born in these enclaves. When they all started moving to the country, they moved to this one area called Rinkeby, which is a shopping center and neighborhood. And it became dominant by Somali refugees. They had kids. Those kids were born in Sweden. They are Swedish, but they are called immigrants by white Swedish people because they're not white Swedes. And Swedish people are extremely racist. Maybe racist isn't the right word, but they're xenophobic. I don't know if I like that word. Let me just put it this way. They're
ethnocentric.
No, they're extremely prejudiced against anybody who is not a native-born white Swede who speaks their language perfectly. So if you are like the encounter that I had with a lot of people who were dual citizens, whose parents were Swedish and then they moved there later, what I found was a lot of people being like, it's really hard for me here because I have an American accent when I speak Swedish, so they don't hire me, they don't want me around, they talk down to me. So what happens then is Rinkeby, these young men who are Somali grow up in a society that treats them like others, but they have no home in Somalia. When you go there, nothing happens. If you go there and you're filming, for instance, there's kind of panic because you're a white person. This is what happened to us, coming with a camera, coming into their neighborhood, and they view themselves as not attached to the state because the police are white people who treat them like they're not Swedish. So they've just formed an isolated enclave, which acts as its own internal state. But you can go there with no problem. I went bowling. They had small pin bowling, I don't know what it's called. Went there, went to the grocery store. Nobody had a problem. There was no wear a veil. There was no Muslim, nothing. It was when you came in acting like you were part of the institutions outside that people would start yelling and saying, what are you doing here? Chaz Chop was completely different. You couldn't even go inside. The George Floyd Autonomous Zone, you couldn't enter these places without passing through a barricade and armed groups. If you went, for instance, in Atlanta, there were shootings. So there's a big difference between there's a group of people that have a dramatically different worldview and view of the state and what the left did when they took these places over.
Yeah, I agree. But the only comparison I was just saying that they have an isolated internal state where they see themselves as something separate from the rest of society, which we already sort of have those places in America, but you could have more that it's ideologically purposed for the left and they're taking over neighborhoods.
You effectively said that you will not believe that there's a civil war until you see a civil war. So I don't see the point of this discussion because if you're not going to accept any amount of evidence that there will be a civil war until there is a civil war, there's nothing I can say to you.
Okay, I'd agree with that. Yeah, I would only say I think there's a civil war going on if there's a civil war going on. That's usually the standard with people when a civil war happens, is that they're seeing the fighting.
Yeah.
And
so that means
they're before us. I mean, we weren't discussing this about the Civil War, where they're insisting we're not in a civil war until Fort Sumter is fired upon.
You can predict this stuff, though. And you know that's not the way any civil war works. And the thing with the 1,000 deaths is I'm open to being wrong. And the reason I would be wrong is that, first of all, I can just objectively be wrong. There's not going to be a civil war.
Well, what would you say is a better
finish the point.
Civil war to look at besides the American Civil War?
Yes. So there's ways to study these conflicts, and I've studied basically every single revolution, and there's a variety of metrics used to predict them in advance. And so the four parallels I look to the most are the English Civil War, the French Revolution, the fall of the Roman Republic, and the American Civil War. And for each of them, if the war starts, there's going to be way more than 1,000 deaths. 1,000 I don't really like. I stand by the bet because I made it with Andrew Heaton a year ago. But if there's going to be a war, 1,000 deaths is what happens in a single wing of a single battle. Because if you look at all those conflicts, English Civil War, American Civil War, French Revolution, fall of the Roman Republic, the society was at peace. The political switch gets flipped, and then there's war. There's not the gradual buildup. It's everything and then nothing. And so what the thing you're looking at where there's a conflict and then it gradually gets worse, that's not how any of this happens. It's their cliff.
So you think
like Eric Pritt said.
Exactly, yeah.
He said in his experience in modern contexts, everyone he's worked with says one day everything's normal, the next day it's war.
Exactly.
But even with the English Civil War and Roman Republic, you've brought this up, it was elite driven. And so you would have to see the fault lines within these elite institutions that would go to war with each other.
Like the Democrats trying to arrest Donald Trump and Trump threatening.
Yeah, if you think that the Republicans and Democrats, as they exist right now, could muster the forces to have a civil war, then that would be a point. But I just don't see that.
What does that mean, muster the forces?
That they could tell their people to commit acts of violence and kill other people.
Oh, that would be so
I don't think the Republicans and Democrats could do that. No.
But when do you think that like world leaders are like, young man, go kill those people? Or do you think they're like, I need you to guard this territory, don't let anyone past? I
don't think they could get them to guard this territory. I mean, nobody's going to, if you're like listening to a lot of these Republican leaders, I mean, besides Trump, but imagine, I'd have to think of, I don't want to say Lindsey Graham because people would be never say, but let's even say Josh Hawley trying to get people to go out there and do that. I don't think so. Even on the Democrat side, I couldn't see
what does do that mean?
What?
I'll be back.
You said Josh Hawley
used the bathroom.
To go say, okay, guard this territory. We need you. Here's a gun. Guard this territory. I don't think they could get their followers to quite do
Why would it be Josh Hawley? When does he in command?
I'm just saying this is a hypothetical.
But it's also it's a nonsensical one that has nothing to do with military.
the thing is, it would be Republican leaders. If you're looking at rival institutions,
Like a governor of a state ordering
it could be a governor of the state, even if it's
ordering his National Guard to say,
like
stand on
Bill
a bridge.
Lee in Tennessee deciding to say, yeah, it could be National Guard, but even with the National Guard, when they go down to the border, it's mainly a photo op. It's not actually that they're.
Whoa, we're arguing two different things. Okay, the argument you made is elites will not be able to give orders to troops to do that, and I'm asking what that is.
Oh, to kill. I actually,
so
you can even see that in the border.
In what context do you think these conflicts are? Okay, troops, we're going to go have you kill people.
No, but they would have to. They're there, and then it's like, should we shoot to kill? And then the governor's like, yes. They'd have to have the.
And that happened in Texas.
They do not have an order to shoot to kill.
In Texas, this is what was so scary. Is they said they were armed with the right to defend themselves from lethal force. And I think that wasn't there a story where they fired across the border or something?
There's been a few stories where they were fired, but even I remember the story where there was a guardsman who the details are blurry, but I remember this. But even with this scenario where if they got challenged by Border Patrol, they're going to back down. I don't think that right now the elites at either the Democrat or Republican level have the capacity to say.
Right.
The order to kill.
I think your view of military and history is like movie-esque. As
How
if
is
they're
it movie, yeah.
like Cobra Commander sitting there being like,
No,
send my troops to go kill them.
It's not
That's
Cobra
never what happens.
What I'm saying is that they have the troops there, and then the chain of command asks, do we have the order to kill? And then the governor at this point and the leadership is not going to give that order. They have to go through the chain of command with the assumption that they would have that order if they're challenged by either the federal government or some left-wing militia or something. I don't see that at this point. I think that there is when they have come up to the precipice of having a point where they challenge either the federal government or challenge the other side, say January 6th or anywhere else, they back down. And you don't really have that capacity for violence. And even when he's bringing up the English Civil War, that's true. It was an elite-driven thing. And
why do cops kill people? Are they given the order to kill?
But they have. It's different from police officers. So
How?
They would have the scenario you're describing. Okay, let's say we're send out the National Guard to an event. And maybe there's
what is the National Guard? Whoa, hold on. See, once again, I think you're making like a lot of movie assumptions.
It's not a movie assumptions.
Yes, it is. So let's take a look at let's say the Democrat Republicans. Right now, Trump has been arrested several times.
Yes, yeah.
He's got 78 charges, I believe. They're trying to put him in jail for hundreds of years, and he's so far complied. What happens if Trump wins the presidency, and then the state of New York says, "Not, you're going to jail." New York has determined you've committed. Bragg says you've committed these crimes. You are being sentenced. The sentencing is delayed. And at the federal level, Trump says, I'm not going to jail. And Secret Service says, whatever you say, Commander in Chief. Yeah. And then they say, then we are going to send authorities to arrest you, and we're going to file that. Do you think that the federal government would allow New York state authorities to enter any other jurisdiction?
Absolutely not. Federal authority trumps state authority. So they would just tell them pound sand.
Right. So then
there would be no constitutional battle.
What would Trump ever? What would happen? Would Trump go to New York?
No. Or he could go to New York because he's like, I'm the head of the state. You're not challenging me, the head of the state. He would even. They've had those battles over whether the president represents the Constitution. He's the constitutional order, and federal authority trumps state authority here. He could go. He could go to New York and tell them to try that. And New York is going to back down in that scenario. They're not going to try to arrest the president because they know how that's going to look on the world stage. They're not going to want to have China, Russia look at a random state arresting the president for paying a porn star. They're not going to have that threat to the federal order.
So first, the several things brought up here is when you said they would not do that. We have to consider what the law enforcement apparatus that exists in this country is. It ranges from there's a wide range of components of force. You have sheriffs and deputies, you have marshals, you have federal authorities. So the question is, if Donald Trump, the Democrats and the Republicans are currently at odds, they're trying to put Trump in prison. There is a constitutional crisis right now that Trump is actually convicted and has not yet faced sentencing, and it's now looking like he's going to win in 11 days.
Yeah.
The polls and betting odds are such that Trump may actually do so well on election day that we don't need 6 days. They may swamp the vote. New York is not going to just announce they're getting rid of these criminal charges. They will still sentence him. I don't know what happens after that. I agree you're likely right that New York's not going to send troops or anybody to go arrest Donald Trump.
Just delay sentencing.
But the issue is not that New York or that Democrats or Republicans are going to say, I hereby declare, send in the troops, kill people. That's nonsense. What happens more likely is that jurisdictions controlled by the federal government will say, we are going to follow the rules and the chain of command, and jurisdictions controlled by Democrats with their authority, National Guard, police, or otherwise, will say we're going to follow the orders of our leadership. There's not likely to be a scenario, or I should say, there is likely to be many scenarios in which the federal government may try to instruct local authorities who say, we don't answer to you. We answered it to the governor, not to the federal government. States are sovereign. In which case, if New York says there is absolutely a potential where New York says Trump has been convicted and must go to jail. He cannot pardon himself at the state level. And then California and Illinois and Washington and Oregon say, if Donald Trump sets foot in our states, we will enforce the law. It's not personal. It's not that we hate Donald Trump. It's that the law applies to everyone and no one is above the law. And he's been convicted before he was president. Getting elected does not change the fact that he has to go to jail. Let's say he goes to Washington and they say, Mr. President, will you peacefully come? You're under arrest to be extradited to New York for your sentencing and jail term. Trump's going to have to say no to that. The states probably, and that's why I don't agree with Rudyard on 1,000 deaths, will be like, there's no way we're going to try to send police to arrest Donald Trump. Because however, we are already asking, this is a question that is already being asked. Donald Trump is under Secret Service protection. And already there's a question of, what if Trump said he would not go to New York to stand trial? We know that the trials are overtly political and none of them make sense. I argued that Donald Trump, when he was in Florida and New York and Georgia issued these criminal charges, what Trump should have done is said, they are welcome to come to Florida and serve the paperwork. I don't listen to TV reports and I do not respect a phone call to a lawyer about what is going on. They can enforce the law as the law prescribes, knock on my door, deliver the warrant, and I will peacefully and gladly join them in answering to these charges. That would put Ron DeSantis in a very serious position where he's going to have to determine whether or not his state authorities are going to abide by New York authorities to come and arrest the guy who's the front runner. Yeah. Trump instead says, I will go by peacefully at your request, despite the fact your lack of ability to enforce this. What happens after Trump wins? And this is reality right now. I'll say this. Trump is convicted. He is facing sentencing. We don't know how this plays out, and we can entertain normalcy and optimism bias. New York just says, we don't care anymore. We're done. I really doubt that. There is the next case where blue states and Democrats who've literally said Trump is Hitler, who's a despot, who's going to go round up illegal migrants, refugees, they would call them. And then what happens when you combine Donald Trump's efforts to deport 15 to 20 million illegal immigrants using the police and local military with the fact that the blue states already say he is a convicted felon who should be in prison? Now they're going to say, as Jamie Raskin already stated this in February, Jamie Raskin said in a panel discussion live on YouTube, Donald Trump is ineligible to be president, and we will block the certification on January 6, 2025. There will be civil war conditions, he said. Now imagine this scenario where Trump wins. We see he wins. He's handily won. Democrats refuse to certify. Kamala Harris counts the vote. Who knows what she does? Let's just say she goes, I understand that these Democrats are refusing to certify, but we still have a majority for certification. Bang, Trump is the president. These Democrats then go to their states and say, not only is Trump a convicted felon who should be in prison, he's not even eligible to be president because of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, and he is illegally occupying the White House through administrative means, and the Supreme Court is protecting him because they're his cronies that he installed. You then end up with blue states saying, if Donald Trump steps foot in this state, he will be arrested and extradited to New York, where we have an agreement to send him. That is all reality. That's potentiality. What we can say right now is we don't know what the blue states will do. But it is true that Democrats have said they won't certify. Trump is a felon and should be in prison. How will blue states handle this worldview that Trump is Hitler, about to round up migrants and refugees, is illegally occupying the White House while ineligible, has stacked the Supreme Court, and should be in prison? How do they rectify that worldview while going, we will do nothing, nothing will happen? It seems to me an impossibility. Now, it is possible that we don't see any formal governance like Newsom or Whitmer or whoever else calling on their National Guard or sheriffs to go arrest Trump. But I think it's entirely possible that you'll see volunteer fighters, people who are just like, I'm here to uphold the rule of law in this country and keep my oath to the Constitution, which is Donald Trump is illegally occupying the White House. And then the risk is if Trump goes to Michigan and militia forces that are aligned with Democrats say Antifa is a better way to describe them, the John Brown Gun Club, the Red Guard, etc., and Antifa's various factions, what do you have, Rose City Antifa and these other wingnut factions, may present such a threat that I would throw it back to what Rudyard said last week. You're not seeing standing armies shooting each other. You're seeing bombs going off in major cities. And he rant over.
Okay, if that actually happened, I would say those are the conditions to set off a civil war, but I'm highly doubtful.
Well,
but I do, if you set out that potentiality where they're like, we will try to arrest Trump by any means necessary, and they do have these militias, and they even maybe want their own law enforcement to try to arrest them, and they effectively try to kidnap the president.
No. I said, I don't see a potentiality where governance tries to arrest Donald Trump. Like, it's a possibility. I shouldn't say there's no potentiality. There's a possibility that Newsom says Trump is a criminal if he steps foot here. I really doubt it. They're going to say, we're not going to do this. But what happens when you have, you already have John Brown Gun Club? This is a guy, one of these guys who asserted himself as Antifa, and I believe he said John Brown Gun Club, went to an ICE facility throwing Molotovs and shooting at ICE agents. I believe it is very likely, terrifyingly so, that if Trump wins with the factors that are already true right now, Democrats have stated he's ineligible and will not certify. Maybe they do certify, but they've still said he's ineligible. They've said the vice president went on TV at a press conference and said he is calling for generals like Hitler. He's a fascist. They believe he's going to round people up and put them in detention centers and concentration camps. These are all facts. These are what have been espoused by the Democrats and the media. And Trump is a convicted felon who is facing sentencing. With those factors in mind and the 2 assassination attempts on Trump already, the likelihood that if Trump goes to a Democrat jurisdiction, he will face extreme violence from roving factions of insurgency, terroristic violence, I believe is 100%. You don't need Newsom to order the National Guard when you have roving bands of leftist extremists who believe Trump is Hitler and will do anything to stop him. There's been 2 assassination attempts and 1 assassination plot, and it is, I would say it's fair to say confirmed that there are Iranian assassination teams going after Donald Trump.
Now, I would not say it's entirely impossible that that happens, but I mean, even with the assassination attempts, those are lone individuals not connected to any militias or any type of...
Well, hold on. We don't know about crooks. There's no official story.
Well, we'll figure it out. For what it looks like now, it looks like some weirdo who tried to make a name for himself, but it could be different. We don't know. So you could be right at the end.
Well, I disagree.
But I would say this on the roving bands of violent extremists. I mean, there has been a decline in that number of leftists. Now they could return with Trump back in office. I mean, they were there during the Trump years. Antifa was pretty violent. They would shut down conferences. And even what we were seeing a few years ago in 2022, you did have these Antifa guys out with AR-15s protecting Drag Queen Story Hour from protesters. Obviously, they didn't need any protection. So you could potentially see that. But I don't think that would be much of a threat to the federal government. If they actually did try to revolt against the federal government would put them down very quickly. Even under Trump.
To be clear, your point of contention is that people wouldn't fight for this war. I'm trying to put your argument
against the federal government. Yeah, there wouldn't be that many people.
I'm trying to put your argument in a spreadsheet. So as I can see, your points of contention are people would not die in this war. Firstly, secondly, that you would not accept evidence for there being a war until said war already starts.
Yes, I agree. Now with the people dying, I mean, there are probably some people who would die, but not enough to make for the conditions.
What are you basing that assessment off? What are you basing?
I'm basing it on the assessment of American people right now. I mean, American people, there's only about like 20% of young men who are even fit for military service. Even with the amount of people who are most politically engaged, it's generally middle-aged people. I mean, young men are probably the least politically engaged demographic in this country. Now, some of them could be animated to fight, but you don't really see that conditions at the moment. And even at the elite level, you don't see people calling for that type of war. And even I know you don't like the American Civil War references, but even in the lead up to the American Civil War, you had many of these Southern leaders of the caliber of John C. Calhoun, Jefferson Davis. These were the titans of the South. They were the leadership cast, and they were saying, we are willing to fight and die for our rights, and we are willing to separate for them. You don't have those voices right now. And even with the Spanish Civil War, if you want to bring up to a more recent conflict, you already had social turbulence in that country where the left had overthrown the monarchical government just a few years before, and the military was still not loyal to the current government, and the military had the instincts and the wherewithal to actually revolt against the civil government. Now, I'd have to say, who, in terms of who would be willing to do the fighting and organizing these people, I don't really see that at the elite level. I mean, there are certainly voices online that may say this, but I don't see this. I don't see the leadership cast going along with this. I don't see that. I don't see a significant mass amount of people who are willing to fight and die for this. They may say that online, but when it actually came to the time to fight, I don't think they would do that.
I am part of the demographic you're describing, and I know that demographic very closely. And there is a lot of young, white, right-wing men who would happily die in a war. And the reason I say that is that we're at a point where that demographic is so screwed over by society that it's the best option. Where if you, and I've been involved in the incel revolution. I made a video on the incel revolution.
You were involved.
You're okay. We found the leader.
In that video, people, it's been memed to hell, and people take it to mean something I didn't actually mean. Where when I talked about that video, I don't think there's actually going to be people who call themselves incels who launch a revolution in order to get laid. I think we're going to have this civil war crisis, and both sides of the civil war will be fought by sexually frustrated young men.
He's completely right. So and this is true of all conflicts. Men who have families don't want to risk their families. True. Men who have nothing to lose. Hence, what you see with Antifa is a bunch of childless men and women who are, I mean, a lot of them are like 40. They have no ties to anything. So risk themselves is just a choice they make.
Yeah.
On the right, you don't see mass protests because guys are like, yo, I've got kids to feed. I got to go to work.
Yeah. No, that's a defining difference between the right and left is the reason why we don't, as you said, we have stuff to lose. People don't, and that's even what happened with the J6 people. They lost their home, they lost their family, they lost their job, they lost everything over that protest.
There are two demographics of right-wingers, and people forget that the latter exists, and they think only of the first. And when I talk to older people, they'll say, oh yeah, the young people who will go hard and they'll sacrifice for the cause among the young are the leftists, and the leftists are the ones who will die in battle, and the rightists won't. And I'm thinking, what planet do you live on? Where if I am a Zoomer. I know many Zoomers. Leftist Zoomers are completely anxious. They're completely incapable of doing anything. And you look at Chaz, you look at the Columbia protests. In the Columbia protests, they put up this whiteboard saying, you can't drink, you can't have sex, you can't swear, you can't misgender any people. That's not an army that fights a war. Among young right-wing white men, there is that demographic because they've been completely screwed over by DEI hiring. They have no social mobility. 2/3 of men under 30 are single. 1/3 of men under 30 are virgins. So you have this huge demographic of basically young white men who are completely screwed over by society, and there's no feedback mechanism for them because society doesn't even acknowledge their issues. So for them, a revolution is a strategically accurate decision to end at because it's their group self-interest that cooperates, and they're completely left out of any other form of power equation, and that's always what starts wars.
Yeah, I totally agree that they have these problems and they are definitely angry and alienated, but they're so far not taking the streets and they're not being organized. I mean, it's almost lone wolves out there with this. And there is a certain demographic among them, but also you have to see is like how many of them are there. There's certainly a lot of them. How many of them are there of their generation? There's also their same demographic that's vaguely right-leaning. This term I've come up with is called FanDuel Americans. And what these people, they're probably going to vote for Trump if they wake up in time. They might be hungover on Tuesday, but they don't really care that much about politics. They're vaguely right-leaning, but what they mainly care about is distractions and amusements. And they have like some fairly right-leaning instincts. You know, they like the troops. They get mad if people don't stand for the anthem and this type of things, but they're not that political. And there's like a huge demographic of those people, but I don't see those people wanting to fight and die. Now, I'm sure there are young right-wingers, if you put them in a situation, they would. But there's no one putting them in that situation. There's nobody organizing them, and they're not taking the streets as is. They don't really have much of a physical presence in the world, which is different from Antifa. Antifa was always out there and showing themselves out in the real world. Meanwhile, the young right-wingers, which is generally smart because society and the system would come down on them much harder than Antifa, they don't turn out on the streets. So I just don't. Maybe if there becomes a critical mass of them and they eventually take to the streets, maybe there is a younger J6 after if Trump loses. I mean, maybe, but I don't see that happening.
You've already said you're not going to change. You won't see it till you believe it, or you won't believe it till you see it. So I don't know what I could say.
If there's a Fort Sumter event, that's basically, it doesn't have to be exactly like Fort Sumter, but there's essentially, everyone agrees that this is a breaking point. There's now violence being committed against between the two sides, and
right. So the challenge is what I think Rudyard and I are making the argument of is we don't know when the Civil War start, what it will look like. He thinks 1,000 people will die, and your position is it will not start at all. But if it happens, then I'll believe it could happen.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Doesn't that seem like?
But I don't think it's going to happen. But I mean,
like we can look at weather patterns and say we might get a hurricane, and then no hurricane happens.
But I'm even looking at the patterns and the lead up. We're not heading to a civil war.
To be fair,
you don't think that the Trump sentencing and the refusal to certify are potentialities of civil war, or like our so let's say a depression forms in off of West Africa. Do our forecasters say there's no hurricane until I see a hurricane? They say
I would say
the chance of hurricane is 6%.
Yeah, or if you wanted me to give percentage chances of this,
that's the point.
Of those leading to civil war, I give you 1%. I'd say that I would give that. Of those,
but you're basically making the same argument that despite the historic parallels, there is nothing where you would make a forecast.
I didn't say that. I'm just saying that when a civil war happens and I can declare it a civil war is when it actually occurs.
What I always find fascinating in these conversations, especially the one I had.
What do you mean by forecasting? But I'm saying the forecast that I'm making is that it does not show civil war. I mean, we could say that a hurricane could theoretically happen, but if the weather conditions aren't there, then we're not having a hurricane.
The weather conditions for a civil war exist right now, but I would call it like a tropical depression in the Atlantic. See, I don't agree.
I would say here's what I would say. I would say the conditions don't exist.
So
we're having for meteorologists, we're having a disagreement over this.
When in American history was the front runner for the presidency a pending sentencing for criminal charges?
All this is unprecedented, but if you look at the conditions on the ground, we are not at the point of it elevating to civil war.
What would the conditions be then? Because we asked you, said there's none.
What do you mean conditions are none?
Rudyard asked you, what are the conditions on the ground that would lead you to believe there is a potential civil war? And you said, not until civil war happens.
No, that's not what I said. He said you will not say that there's a civil war until you see it, and which is yes. But what I was saying, if you're looking at conditions, there would have to be mass, or there would have to be extreme economic poverty or extreme economic conditions that are making people starve. Second is that you're seeing at least some type of low-level violence, the modern equivalent of Bleeding Kansas already happening, or something, and that there's a weak state, and it's okay. Go. I'll let you.
Number one, you said extreme poverty. Okay, Rudyard. Are there examples of civil war in which there was not extreme poverty, or is extreme poverty a requirement?
Last American Civil War, we weren't in extreme poverty. There was significantly more social mobility in the previous Civil War than the current one, and we had significantly lower inequality. Yeah, almost no one was starving at the last Civil War.
Do you reject that?
I'm just saying this is one of the conditions.
Well, he just said the American.
No, it's actually absolutely true that we didn't have the type of poverty.
So that would not be a prerequisite for civil war.
We definitely had more poverty at that time, but in comparison to the rest of the world, no, we had much greater abundance.
So that's not a prerequisite then, because civil wars have happened without extreme poverty.
Let me go over the other conditions. Okay, one thing is definitely a weak state, or if you're wanting to fight against, if the state would have to significantly weaken from what it is right now to have a civil war. at this point because the state is
What was the second? So the first point is in contest.
Second point is that you're having low levels of violence either between non-state actors in the state or between non-state actors that spills out of control that the state can't control. Which would also require a weakened state.
Can you describe a threshold of violence that is quantifiable so that we could say yes or no to this point? Like, is there a certain number of deaths?
Levels of violence that where dozens are dying and it's like people are shooting each other. Like I would even say if like the conditions of Weimar Germany in like 32 where the communists and the Nazis were getting into gun battles, and there was also the fear that they would have to deploy the military to stifle it. You definitely had the Civil War conditions.
So Bleeding Kansas, you said, correct?
It would be a Bleeding Kansas-like event where two sides are
right. So
using lethal force against each other.
Do you know what the historical academic term for what Bleeding Kansas was?
What do you mean? A civil war?
No. Civil strife. It is, in academia, you don't have to agree with academia, Bleeding Kansas is called civil strife. The civil rights movement was also called civil strife. Civil strife is the precursor to civil war. And there is an academic threshold by which they believe civil strife has begun.
Do you think civil strife is upon us now?
Don't ask me. According to academics, the answer is yes.
Well, what are the standards there?
70 deaths per year related to political causes.
The 70 deaths that they would say are these maniacs who go to like a Dollar General and shoot people. But I would not declare that. A lot of the academic standards that they have, the rules, you would have to agree that a lot of the stupid shootings of these morons that they claim is white supremacist violence, when it's just some maniac doing what is the equivalent to a school shooting, is going to a Dollar General and saying it's political violence. I don't trust their standard for what claims is political violence.
I think when they say it's like white supremacy, clearly that's an absurdity because it describes nothing. But when Rudyard mentions that there are young white men with no upward mobility who have become sexually frustrated and otherwise, I guess, dejected, they decide to act out violence.
Yeah, but most of them are not. Nearly all of them are not.
What do you mean?
I mean, besides like one every like year going on a school shooting or of some sort, what other acts of violence that they're committing? They're not taking the streets. They're not organizing.
That's not Bleeding Kansas either. Bleeding Kansas.
You're saying the civil strife, but okay, we're leading the standards of civil strife. What are these young men who are angry or sexually frustrated?
Let's go back to your example of Bleeding Kansas. It was not a bunch of young men marching to the streets.
Correct. It was two sides organizing militias to fight and kill each other in a territory to gain political control.
Towards the end of it, like in the beginning, John Brown just went and killed people.
Yeah, they were organizing militias, and also they had the border ruffians that Missouri was sending over to kill abolitionist settlers. I mean, and to take political control. But I'm just saying, what conditions do you have of civil strife besides that there's these academics looking at random mass shootings that some maniac claims that there's a political motivation for? But there's a sign that there's civil strife.
By all means, I accept you argue their definition is ill-fitted. That's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is academics have said, wow, we're in civil strife. So by all means, if your point is I disagree with them, fair point, I accept that. I'm not here to argue that the academic definition of civil strife is right or wrong. I don't know what you think, Rudyard.
Oh, I don't care what the academics say. I don't think it fundamentally matters.
I think we're all in agreement on that.
But so the second point you made as a prerequisite was violence to a certain degree of people shooting each other, and you don't think that's...
Let me go over, I know we have a little bit of time, but all the prerequisites. These are not all absolutely required, as I need to go back and say, but it's also you have to have elite institutions that are hostile to each other and are fighting for political power in a way that is like English Civil War between Parliament and the monarch, or even the Spanish Civil War between the civil government and the old forces that favored the more right-wing form of governance they had before. You would have to have hostile elite forces that are willing to fight and kill each other, which now with the United States, if you look at the institutions, pretty much most of them are committed to some form of unity, even with the GOP. Trump might not be on the same platform with the rest of the GOP, but the GOP, the Democrats, the military, the police, every important institution in America would agree on unity, even state governors.
Well, we do have a time constraint here, so I don't know if Rudyard, you want to add any final thoughts before we wrap up and some shout outs?
No, thank you so much for having me. I'm Rudyard from Whatifalthist. You guys can keep going, but I have a pre-established commitment at noon.
Oh, no. Yeah, we'll wrap it up. So I appreciate you guys, both of you coming. I don't know, Scott, if you want to take any final thoughts or shout anything out before we go.
Thanks for having me. Scott Greer. Follow me on Twitter at Scott M. Greer and at Substack, highly-respected.com. I have tons of content there. So if you enjoyed my talk, or maybe if you hated me, you can leave some great comments there or on Twitter.
Right on. Well, thanks for both of you for hanging out. I thought it was pretty good. I'm going to just wrap by saying, hey, look, man, I'm the one who talks about the potentiality of civil war quite a bit, but I do not agree with Rudyard. I cannot see 1,000 deaths by April. That would be a persistent 4-month summer of love at the start of the county electoral college. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm not. I hope it is fair to say that Trump turns things around. The economy begins to improve. I'm hoping that we see with this election, it's looking already 11 days out, and I hope it's true, with the Republicans already leading in some swings. I think North Carolina absentee ballot returns are showing Republicans winning. I'm hoping that we get a popular vote victory for Trump of a substantial portion, a couple percentage points, an electoral college victory, which is an overt rebuke of leftist ideology in this country that results in many apathetic normal people becoming less tolerant out of a fear of being on the wrong side of history. So what ends up happening then is Trump wins. He wins handily. Everybody cheers. People start wearing MAGA hats. The left is shunned. The weird woke ideologies are pushed out of media, as we've already seen. And then there is no need for conflict. And we exit this period, same as any other period of tumult with no real violence. And then 4 years from now, the debate between Democrats and Republicans would be much more moderate because Democrats will be forced closer to the center. We will see. Thank you all so much for hanging out, guys. Thanks for joining us. We're back tonight at 8 p.m. over at youtube.com/TimCast, but I do have more clips over at youtube.com/TimCastNews. Thanks for hanging out. You can follow me on X and Instagram at TimCast, and we'll see you all there.